This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 938 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to remind you that even though you drafted your fantasy teams back in August, you can still do snake drafts right now over on Underdog. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. In the draft section, click NFL, and you'll see tons of drafts that you can participate in right now. And if you're new to Underdog, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus, as well as my rest of season rankings. Those rankings are updated for you each Tuesday once you get the link to them. But to get them, you have to sign up, use promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. Add Zamir White. So just last week on this show, I talked about Alexander Mattison being a buy because he'd been performing like a bell cow, but no one seemed to care. Now, when talking about Mattison, I talked about how fragile his situation was. When we're talking about non-elite players in fantasy football, there's always a chance that their usage changes. We're not talking about Bijan Robinson here. We're talking about Alexander Mattison. He's not locked in to see a bell cow workload. And that can impact a fantasy asset's bottom line. That's part of the reason that he has a lot less value, despite the fact that he was seeing a lot of work. Now on Sunday, obviously Mattison went out and he had his lowest running back rush share in a month. And it wasn't that Zamir White was just taking over that backfield. Mattison saw significantly more snaps than White did. It's just that a negative game script hit and Amir Abdullah ended up playing the most snaps in that backfield as their pass catching back. Now I'm bringing all of this up because these situations are not set in stone. When discussing these mid-tier players, things can change in a literal instant. And that's especially true when the people making those decisions are no longer around. The Raiders fired offensive coordinator Luke Getsy on Monday. Things are changing for the Raiders. And if that means that the Raiders want to divvy up that backfield differently, then they're going to divvy up that backfield differently. They have a bye week this week. What if they come out of their bye and they say that Zamir White is now our lead back? So I would be willing to stash Zamir White in order to find out. And this could obviously go in the other direction too and severely favor Alexander Mattison. We just don't know. We should prefer Mattison based on how he's performed, based on how he's seen work. But this call out on today's show during a weak waiver wire week, this is to say that yes, Zamir White has had a rough year, but volume is volume. And if his coaching staff wants to give him more volume, then Zamir White could be viable in fantasy football. Because coaches at running back, they're the ones who are dictating how much work a particular player is going to see. And what if this coaching staff, what if these changes mean that Zamir White gets a little bit more work? Buy Marvin Harrison Jr. So there's been a real lack of consistency from Marvin Harrison Jr. this year. And I know that fantasy managers who have him, they're annoyed. He had 3 straight weeks of 15 plus PPR points earlier this season. And then it was a stretch of just horrible outings. Then in week 8, he had that 23-point outing. And then he followed that up with just 2 catches for 34 yards and a fumble. The Cardinals' passing attack was not very good in week 9. They had a tough matchup, but it was also partially because they didn't have to be that good. They only had 19 total targets. And the good news for Marvin Harrison Jr., he had 5 of them. He had a 26% target share. Since week 1 in completed games, Harrison Jr. has averaged a target share per game rate of 27.5%. He hasn't fallen below 21% in a single game during this stretch. Those are really good numbers. He just hasn't converted very well. But a 51% catch rate, which is where he's at right now, that's a pretty low number. Like sustaining that low of a number might be hard to do. And yes, some of that has to do with a low catchable targets rate. But the Cardinals have a chance to turn that around down the stretch. According to adjusted fantasy points allowed, they have the 3rd best short-term schedule for wide receivers. Their rest of season schedule is 9th best. Now, it might be a little bit tough against the Jets this week, but after New York, the matchups look pretty good. You don't need to be overly aggressive here. It's just always a good idea to try to get someone cheap who's coming off a bad game or multiple bad outings when the target share is there and the talent is there. You want to always match those things up. Add Demario Douglas. So I talked about Demario Douglas on this show in the past, but he's still rostered in just 22% of Yahoo leagues. That number needs to be higher. Drake May and Demario Douglas have really only played 2 games together this year. May's made 4 starts and he finished 3 of them, but Douglas was sick during one of them. He didn't play that much against Jacksonville after, quote, vomiting all day leading up to the game. That means there's basically been 2 games of Drake May and Demario Douglas. And in those games, Douglas has seen target shares of 29% and 23%. He scored 21.2 PPR points and 10.5 PPR points. I said it before, I'll say it again. There's a chance that Demario Douglas is Drake May's new Josh Downs. Buy the New York Giants passing attack. I hope none of you are driving while listening to this because you might have gotten in an accident when you just heard me say that. Buying the New York Giants passing attack? Why would we do that? Now, no one's trying to sell this as the Giants being a top-notch offense. It's just that their rest of season schedule is amazing. Let me just read out their final games through the fantasy season. You ready? This week they get Carolina, then it's Tampa Bay, Dallas, New Orleans, Baltimore, Atlanta, and Indianapolis. Those matchups give Daniel Jones the number 1 fantasy schedule at quarterback, both in the short and the long term. The wide receiver schedule is 4th best rest of season. Now, many are rightfully concerned about the sustainability of this Giants offense without Andrew Thomas on the offensive line. Well, through the end of the fantasy season, they'll be facing just 1 below average matchup in pressure rate, which is Dallas. That should be very helpful for this passing attack. So Daniel Jones is a good streamer this week because he does get Carolina. But you could go out and trade for Malik Neighbors right now. That'd be a buy low moment. You could even go out and add Darius Slayton off the waiver wire because we know how Slayton performed without Neighbors. He's almost like a handcuff. And then you layer on this schedule, these opponents and these matchups, things are looking decent. And I stress the word decent for this Giants passing attack. Sell Rico Dowdle. So just going back to what I was saying earlier, when we have a non-elite player, there's a lot that can change with his usage from one week to the next. And that's what scares me with Rico Dowdle. Dak Prescott is set to miss some time. And even though he's had a pretty average season by Dak Prescott standards, a below average season, he's still the Cowboys starter for a reason. Prescott being out will lower the number of scores this Dallas Cowboys offense generates. And fewer scores means less opportunity for the players in that offense, including Rico Dowdle. Dowdle's coming off a game where he hit season highs in snap share and running back rush share. But as we know, Ezekiel Elliott didn't play in that game. Dowdle's the most talented back on that roster, but I don't think anyone would say that Rico Dowdle is a special running back. And there were obvious different circumstances in week 9. So where I'm at with him is that if you look at their next 2 games, they get Philly and Houston. Those are 2 of the 3 toughest matchups for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So if you're sitting there right now with 3 wins, 4 wins, maybe even 5 wins, you might want to consider flipping Dowdle this week, because this could hypothetically be a high point. The Dallas playoff schedule is kind of average. Their running back matchups after the next couple of weeks, they're okay. So if you want to hold Dowdle, that's fine. This is more of a recommendation. If you need production right away, I am concerned about Dowdle over their next couple of games. And this could be a sell high moment because he had over 20 PPR points in week 9. Add Quinton Johnson. So this one's going to be quick. Quinton Johnson returned to the Chargers lineup in week 9. He had a great outing. He scored 22 PPR points. He had a 19% target share. He's now been at that 19% target share mark in 4 of 6 games this year. Now, I don't think you're getting a league-winning player with Johnston, and Ladd McConkey, he's been the dude seeing the most targets in that offense. He's the one that you want. But I think that Johnston's a solid option in a bye week fill-in for like a 12-team league. Buy Jaylen Waddle. When it comes to how the market is viewing Jaylen Waddle right now, there's no doubt in my mind that he's at a low point. Now, could his production remain the same? Could he continue playing pretty poorly, which would make him even less desirable? Sure, but how much further would that drive his value? Right now, my mentions on Twitter are filled with people asking if they should drop Jaylen Waddle. There are Reddit threads talking about dropping Waddle. Now, I want to be clear here. I had Waddle as a draft target entering the season. So some of you are probably listening to this and saying that, oh, JJ just can't take an L. I can take an L. The Jaylen Waddle recommendation, that was more than likely an L. I say more than likely because the season's not over yet. But as I wrote in the newsletter this week, I'm a big boy. I can take an L. It's going to happen all the time. I've taken many of them throughout my career. This is just a probability-driven play. Nothing more than that. This is game theory. We have 3 years of data showing us that Jaylen Waddle is a good wide receiver. He's seen his yards per route run rate prior to this year get better every single season. Across his first 3 years in the league, that yards per route run rate was never below 1.75. That's something that only 17 other wide receivers have been able to accomplish since 2011. And all of those wide receivers are perennial Pro Bowlers, aside from Hunter Renfrow. And again, those are players who for the first 3 years of their career had at least a 1.75 yards per route run rate each season. Let's just look at the facts here. Let's just lay it out. Waddle's played in 4 games this year with Tua. 2 of those games were against the Bills. That's a team that's been more of a run funnel this season. He also faced the Jags and the Cardinals, and in those games, he had 109 and 45 receiving yards. That's not totally abnormal. Now, like I talked about on last week's mailbag episode, Waddle's target shares, they've been a little bit lower this year. That's because the running back target shares and the tight end target shares on the team have been higher. But as I said on the mailbag episode, Waddle had a tough matchup in week 9. Not only that, the exact same thing can be said about Tyreek Hill. It just hasn't been as bad as Jaylen Waddle. Miami's also been losing. And to reiterate what I've been saying, we're working with a small sample size. It's been 4 games. Technically, less than 4 games. Because Tua was knocked out of one of them. We're working with small sample sizes. 4 games is not a big sample. It's not a big enough sample, in my opinion at least, to all of a sudden say that Jaylen Waddle is bad. And look, guys, I'm not saying that everything's just going to turn around for Jaylen Waddle, that he's all of a sudden going to live up to his draft day cost. I highly doubt that's going to happen. What I am saying is that he's a talented player who has underperformed. Maybe that's not enough for you. But for me, I would gladly send some bench assets to get Waddle and throw him on my bench. I would love to have a talented player like Jaylen Waddle just sitting there in case things do turn around. That's what this transaction is all about. Add Mike Gesicki. So Mike Gesicki had a really big game in week 9 for 2 main reasons. Well, maybe 3. I'll say the first one is the matchup. The second one, though, is that T. Higgins was out. In games with T. Higgins this year, Gesicki has averaged a target share per game rate of just 5.2%. When Higgins has been out, that number shoots up to 19%. The third thing, though, is that Eric All tore his ACL. That contributed to Gesicki running around on 61% of Cincinnati's dropbacks. That was a season high. We don't know when T. Higgins is going to be back. And this All injury does open things up for the tight ends on Cincinnati, obviously including Mike Gesicki. So I think he should be rostered in most leagues now. Buy Jawan Jennings. We're not that far removed from Jawan Jennings posting 46 PPR points against the Rams. That happened back in week 3. Jennings has only played in 3 games since then. Those 3 outings have been pretty average, but he also hasn't been active since Brandon Ayuk tore his ACL. He's about to be more of a full-time guy in this offense. He's likely going to take on a lot of slot work. And that's really big, because when Jawan Jennings has played this year, he's been good. PFF has him charted as a top 15 wide receiver this year. Fantasy Points just a couple of weeks ago had him as a top 3 player in their separation win rate metric. Jawan Jennings' yards per route run rate this year, 2.75. That's amazing. I'm not calling him out because San Francisco has this really great schedule or something. It's pretty average. I'm just calling him out because I think people have forgotten that Jawan Jennings is about to take on a serious workload. Or at least he has the potential to. And he's been very good this year. He hasn't played in a few weeks, but I'm expecting, if he is active, I'm expecting him to do well. Add Aaron Rodgers. So look, I don't think Aaron Rodgers is going to be some league-winning quarterback. but he's been averaging over 17 points per game over his last 4. And 2 of those 4 games came against teams that are pretty good against quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. We know the weapons are there for him. And the Jets get the Cardinals, Colts, Seahawks, Jaguars, and Rams in 5 of their next 6 games. Those are all top 12 favorable opponents for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Rodgers could be in store for a pretty nice stretch in fantasy football. And right now, he's only rostered in about 43% of Yahoo leagues. Buy Breece Hall. Having Breece Hall on your fantasy team has been a roller coaster this year. I totally understand that. But I do think that we're staring at an obvious buy low opportunity right now. He's had back-to-back down performances. He scored 9.9 and 10.5 PPR points over his last 2 games. His Week 8 usage was a little bit concerning. He only had a 57% running back rush share. But his Week 9 running back rush share jumped up to 79%. And then all the while, Hall's dipped below a 12% target share just once this season. The usage is there. He's seeing a lot of work. He might give up a little bit of goal line work to Braylon Allen here and there, and his carries might fluctuate a bit. But in this running back environment, where it's not easy to find a bell cow, Breece Hall is a bell cow. That's why we shouldn't assume that he's going to continue down this 10-point per game pace. And that's especially true because Jets running backs have the 5th best rest of season schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they have arguably the best playoff schedule too. In weeks 15, 16, and 17, the Jets get the Jags, Rams, and Bills. Jacksonville and Buffalo in particular, they're top 3 opponents for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I'm expecting Breece Hall to be totally fine. Add Demarcus Robinson. I guess we got to talk about Demarcus Robinson because he's been playing pretty well over his last 2 games. He scored almost 45 PPR points over that time frame. Now, there are obviously a lot of caveats here. 2 weeks ago, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua didn't run their normal number of routes. And then this past week, in the middle of the game, Puka Nacua was ejected. Robinson 2 weeks ago had just a 9% target share, but this past week, it was 21%. I don't think we should be super bullish here. I just don't think that the waiver wire this week is very strong. But we saw Robinson with a nice stretch last year. What if he does it again this year? Add Noah Brown. To be honest, if I were to compare Noah Brown to Demarcus Robinson, I'd probably prefer Noah Brown. I've talked about Brown a lot on the Sleeper Show this year. He was actually a sleeper last week. He came through with a 5-catch, 60-yard performance, and he had a 31.6% target share. He's been Washington's number 2 wide receiver for a while now. With this strong performance, though, you have to wonder if more work might be going his way. Add Ray Ray McCloud. So as I've been saying, I don't really love this week's waiver wire. I'm not going to repeat transactions like adding Taysom Hill like I talked about last week or Cedric Tillman like I did a couple of weeks ago. You guys already have that information. So we can move on and look at a deeper play, which is adding Ray Ray McCloud. Drake London has an injury that doesn't sound super serious, but there's a chance that he could miss this weekend's game against the Saints. Now, McCloud does not play the same position that Drake London does. Yes, they're both wide receivers, but they're not the same kind of wide receiver, and they don't line up in the same spots. But without London, hypothetically, more targets could be funneled McCloud's way. And he doesn't have a bad matchup this week against the Saints. So just monitor this Drake London injury as the week goes on. Add the New York Giants defense. So I know that the Saints didn't come through last week when they played the Panthers. They weren't a good streaming option. They were a little bit banged up, and they also haven't generated that much pressure defensively this year. They've been a bottom 3 team in quarterback pressure rate. That's different with this New York team. They've been 15th in pressure rate, and they're first in the NFL in sack rate. That could cause some serious issues for Bryce Young and company. So as 4.5-point favorites, I do like this Giants defense this week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.